Radio Retrofuture.
Well, welcome ladies and gentlemen to a new episode of Radio Retrofuture. I am Bonsert and with me today is Carl Jackson, a comic book artist. So yeah, let's start right there. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing.
Hey, well, I'm British, obviously, as you can probably tell by my accent. But I currently live in Budapest, Hungary, where I'm a music teacher. So obviously I'm into my music, and then my other thing that I'm really into is my comic books. And through my comic books and doing this, I've started to really get into steampunk that I was into anyway, but never really knew. So it's quite a new tangent for me to go down. So yeah, so that's where I am at the moment. So we've got our comic on Kickstarter, which is Victorian Bare Knuckle League, which is basically a steampunk comic. I think if you imagine like a steampunk version of Enter the Dragon or Street Fighter 2, that kind of thing, like a fighting tournament, but with steampunk characters, then that is what the comic book is. It's got an element of a revenge story in, like each different character has their own reason for being there, and it starts off following one particular character and her own revenge tale. So that kind of brings this like Kill Bill kind of element to it, and she has this Shakespearean tragedy arc where she descends gradually, bit by bit, into quite a violent being from quite a nice, gentle young lady, without giving too much of the plot away. That's the way it's going to go.
Okay. And the Kickstarter itself ends in 21 days, if I'm correct?
Yeah, it's 21 days, yeah.
Yes. So that will probably be 20 days by the time this video has been posted. Then, you know, I've watched some of the, let's say, the rewards. Like for $4 you can get a digital issue on PDF, which I really enjoy. I might actually get that one. For $8 you already have the physical copy, so that's good. And let's see, are there any other particular rewards people can expect if they support your project?
Yeah, every comic that you buy, I'm going to sign. So depending on how many get bought, that's me going to take a weekend out signing comics. So you're going to get it signed. After the physical reward, we have a variant cover. Our cover's been done by a lady called Maria Sinapo, and she's a current DC Comics artist. Quite a big, like, of the moment DC Comics artist. So she's doing the cover that you'll see on all the promo things. So we've got a variant cover by her, and then after that, a lot of it is things like actually you taking control of the comic. So we've got reward levels where you can get drawn in the comic. We've got somewhere you have to choose some sort of Victorian insult. And there's only one of them left, actually, because that went really quick. Like, people were really quick on that one and had some really good ones. And then you can design some of the outfits for the characters. We have one character who's a detective, a steampunk detective, Vanderbrook, and she never goes out wearing the same outfit twice. So you can design a hat for her if you would like to. And then the last one is you can decide what the finishing move is in the comic book. So they're the ones that we've got left at the moment.
But you already said you were always kind of into steampunk, but how did you learn about it?
Like, I'd always been a massive fan of like steampunk Victorian literature, you know, like Jules Verne and things like that. And I always remember I had this game on the PlayStation, and it was called Vandal Hearts, and it was like a little RPG. And before, kind of the term steampunk is a fairly new term for this genre, and before that even came about, there was a character on this game, and he was a little engineer character, and he was basically just a steampunk engineer without the tag of a steampunk engineer. And I became obsessed with this little guy, and like I used to draw pictures of him and like mechanical arms and things for him and stuff like that. And then I've always been a massive fan of like Victorian era dramas, and things like that. And then it kind of all came together in this. And as I started doing this comic, I started delving more and more into steampunk and reading more steampunk graphic novels and books. And that's how I became part of it. Like, I don't want to say that I've dressed up in steampunk outfits, because I'm still making my first one now, actually.
Okay.
Like, this is my gun that I'm starting on.
Okay.
So it's getting...
I think
was
I
like
actually
a
seen
Nerf
that one
gun.
on Facebook.
Yeah. So I've got like I'm in amongst like glue guns and stuff like that. So I've just started making like little outfits and things like that. So I'm training as a pro wrestler as well. Like, I live in Hungary, and I've joined a wrestling association, and we've already got like a steampunk character, but I've taken on this kind of persona of this like English bare knuckle boxer that I'm going to kind of, I don't know, I'll be maybe the bad guy, and he's quite a good guy. So yeah, that's the way it's developing at the minute.
Also seen the Clockwork Fisticuff Society?
Yeah, you sent me that. Yeah, I had a look. I saw your interview with them.
Oh.
It sounds really interesting. Like, there's so many things. Like, I watched the interview, and the guy was saying about he was a pro wrestler, and when I was writing the comic, I wrote the fight scenes and just basically wrote it, what happens now. But there's actually like a 7-point sequence that you go through when you're learning how to put a match together in pro wrestling. And I think anybody who writes any sort of one-on-one combat sequence in any sort of scenario should learn that 7 steps of pro wrestling, because it transfers so well to writing any sort of combat. You know, like, the first part of it is an establishment, which is basically showing who your characters are, and then there's bits where like you've got to have the bad guy winning, so the audience have someone to root for, and it's all like psychology without giving too much of it away. I mean, you can find it out online anyway. But I think anybody who writes combat should go through those steps, and I think anybody who has done any sort of pro wrestling and knows how to put a match together should be pretty good at writing combat, whether it's in literature or whether it's in a comic book. So I think any Victorian kind of steampunk fight in pro wrestling goes well together, you know. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you could cite a source for those 7 points, I'd be very interested in that, and I'm sure a lot of writers are as well, because I haven't heard of it yet.
Yeah, if you just go on the internet and put in like 7 steps like pro wrestling, and it's basically, I'm not giving that much away. Like, it doesn't. When you train as a pro wrestler, you learn these 7 steps. So the first one is like you establish your characters. Okay, and then you obviously establish the good guy, you obviously establish the bad guy, and then the next steps are that the bad guy takes over for a little bit, but then the good guy comes back, so the audience have something to root for. Then the bad guy comes back, okay, so the audience want the good guy to win, and you have to put in these little steps that kind of like build it up every time. So that it's like a spring coiling. You push the spring down and release it a little bit, push it down and release it until you get this big pop at the end of your combat. So if you look it up online, I think anybody who's writing combat should follow that, you know, like, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. That's very interesting. You also mentioned, you know, the inspiration for the Victorian Bare Knuckle League. Like Street Fighter and Kill Bill. That's actually how you describe it, Kill Bill style revenge tale. And you know, I don't know if you've seen my video, but there is one video that I described steampunk basically as pop culture in the past. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I totally would. And that, it was like I was saying before, like, it's a really strange thing, because I mean, usually pop culture starts as something small, with a small group of people and expands and becomes big. And I think steampunk is the only pop culture phenomenon where you can actually see it like 100 years ago, and it's always been there, but this pop culture phenomenon has never kind of got bigger until now, even though it's been there, if that makes sense. So I don't know, let me give an example. Like punk. So let's look at punk. So it came about in like 1977, and you can maybe like trace it back to like the late 60s in the USA, but you couldn't trace it back to like 1880, or you couldn't trace it back to like 1900. Where with steampunk, you've got this like really kind of massive thread going through history and pop culture, and it's like always been there, kind of like lying under the surface without anybody really noticing it until now. And I think that's probably what's the most exciting thing about it, you know. And I met you on the Steampunk Empire forum, and you know, sometimes there's people put things on there like, is this steampunk and things like that, and it's like, you know, that's exciting when people haven't quite like got down what that genre fully is, you know. Like, we know it's kind of like Victorian fantasy, but there's so many other places it could go and has been, and we will pull back in. But that's what I really like about it. Like, that's what attracts me to it most, I think. And I don't really think like it's even as big as it will get. You know, it's just, I think you just wait. It's just a matter of time until some model walks down a catwalk in some sort of steampunk outfit, and you're going to see steampunk fashion in like H&M and things like that. It's just waiting to happen. Yeah, it's just bubbling under the surface.
Yeah, well, I should really make a kind of a compilation of what people have said about it on the show and then on the panels that we've had, because, you know, for me, and you know, my comparison to compare it to pop culture in the past is quite recent in my mind. But one of the things that I found always very important about steampunk was, and you basically said it yourself, is the timelessness about it. Like, you know, there are things that are old, and they're like time capsules. You mentioned steampunk, but you could also say that for the interior of certain houses. Let's take, you know, the decorations in houses from the 70s. Yeah, you know, they're quaint in our minds, but it's not something we would choose for ourselves. Yeah, it has that nostalgia factor, and that's it. Well, steampunk seems to, you know, pick all those things that don't age. Like, they in our minds, they still they have the same pleasing aesthetic. And that's, you know, that for me is steampunk. That sense of timelessness, that there is an aesthetic out there that everybody will enjoyed 100 years ago and will enjoy 100 years from now.
I think you can tell that by like it kind of splintering off into things like diesel punk and cyberpunk and things like that. I mean, like, I was looking the other day at old He-Man toys, like He-Man figures, and if you look at He-Man, like, there's a real like steampunk aesthetic in like some of the weapons that they had, you know, because it was like sword and sorcery and science at the same time. So if you look at the weaponry that the toys came with, they have these like really steampunk guns and like these steampunk tanks and things that they're driving about in, and it's like that was the 80s. So yeah,
well, it's funny that you mentioned it, because we had a lot of cartoons from the 80s and 90s, but many of them were forgotten, yet something as cheesy as He-Man remained. You know, that's, you know, sometimes we see a cartoon, it's like, oh yeah, that existed at one point. And there's He-Man. Everybody knows who He-Man is, even now. So maybe there is that timeless aesthetic as well in that show that makes it so memorable.
Yeah, like thinking about that, there was actually quite a lot of steampunk cartoons back in the 80s. Like, I used to watch Round the World with Phileas Fogg, and he was like a lion.
Yeah.
And there was like a full-on Saturday morning cartoon of that, and that was quite a big cartoon.
Yeah.
And there was
Teddy
one called
Ruxpin also.
yeah, Teddy Ruxpin, yeah, again, yeah.
Yeah.
So that was an awful lot.
Yeah. So it always has been there. We just didn't give it a name up till Kiwi Jeter coined it in the 80s.
Yeah.
Because it became basically a literary genre based upon it. So that's rather interesting. But we kind of digressed. I'm watching now at your Kickstarter page, and there I see a kind of Sagat-like character punching a, well, rather Victorian-looking gentleman. Were there particular characters in your comic that are based upon specific fictional characters from other genres or franchises?
Basically, I started researching it. I was in Ripper Street. I'm sure this is where the first idea came from. Have you seen Ripper Street? Yeah, you watched that show?
Ripper Street. I know. I've heard the name somewhere before, but unfortunately, I haven't watched it.
You need to watch it. It's on Amazon Prime.
Okay.
I think it's probably one of the best TV series that I've ever watched. To be honest, I will go down as saying that. Ripper Street, and it's about 3 police officers, and they're in Whitechapel just after the Jack the Ripper murders, and it's 5 series, and it's basically the tale of those 3 men. One's the police inspector, one's his assistant, and one's his doctor. And it's them in Whitechapel, just after the Ripper murders, basically doing their police business, but it's just so much more, like so much more. Yeah, but I think one of the best TV series I've ever seen. And if you like your Victoriana and your steampunk, you need to watch it. And the last series has just gone on Amazon Prime, and it's just like absolutely breathtakingly good. Amazing show. But in the first series of that, there's a scene where there's a bare knuckle bout, and I'm a big Street Fighter fan, and I can remember thinking, wow, why hasn't someone done like a Victorian, like a bare knuckle beat 'em up game? And I just started drawing the characters, and then I started researching and reading into it. And I found that once I'd started researching it and reading into the characters, like a lot of the characters and the stories were already there or had already been there. And I didn't need to make up stories and characters because these people had already existed, And there's so many different tales of people like duchesses that had become widowed and fell on hard times and basically just bare knuckle boxed for money. So you had these really well-to-do women who just fallen on hard times and were just like fighting their way for a living. The guy called Mabutu, who's the one I think that you're looking at on the front screen punching someone in the face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That guy's based on an actual character. He was a slave in the Americas, and basically he was witty or whatever, and managed to get bought by this English duke who quite liked him and thought he was a good lad, and took him to England and trained him up as a bare knuckle boxer, and he ended up becoming like a British bare knuckle boxing champion. So he basically went from slave to mixing with aristocracy, and being this like well loved bare knuckle champion in this place that wasn't his home country or anything. And then after that, I just once I'd got those guys, those main characters, it just started spiraling. I just had so many ideas. In fact, I've actually got a stack of characters that just aren't in the first 4 issues that I've got planned, because I just can't fit every single character in. I've got some really good ideas for people that I want in, but I'm just gonna have to stick with those ones for now, I think.
Yeah.
To make a good story.
Okay, so do you have ambitions to make a kind of a follow-up or some similar comic?
I've got about 15 issues of this written.
Okay.
First story arc. So issue 1 is the one that's on Kickstarter now, and that storyline will last for 4 issues. and then after that I've got about 10 more, and each arc can be read as an individual story, but the whole thing has an overriding theme, and I know where it's going, and it's going to climax, and the characters that you see at the beginning will be quite different from the ones that you see at the end.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, and do you have an idea how many issues it will last?
Well, yeah, I'd like to keep it ongoing, to be honest. Like, I wouldn't want a definitive end for it, and I really plan it to be something other than a comic. Like, my first idea for it was that it would be a video game, but I have no idea how to make video games, and I know that they're massively expensive to make. Where I do know a lot about comic books and graphic novels. Like, I'm a collector and I've read them since I was 6 year old, and I worked in a comic book shop, you know, and it's like, it's my passion. So I knew comic books, and I thought that's the easiest way for me to go with it. But after I've done the comic book, I really want to take it like somewhere else. I'd love to see an animation of it. And I'd love it to be published as an ongoing, you know. I've been talking to a publisher who wants to publish the first 4 issues collected as kind of a graphic novel.
Right.
So that's a good start. But I would like to see it as an ongoing, you know, like not even picked up by a big company, just one that'll put it out monthly.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let me see where to. Could you tell us a little bit about the history of these bare knuckle fighting leagues? Is there?
Yeah, it basically, it's really funny because I was thinking like some of the questions you might ask me before, and it's really strange because obviously we're dealing with steampunk and we fictionalize things, and you know, I've been putting these things out on the internet, and one guy was like, saw one of the character designs for one of the main characters, and he was like, he was basically chastising me because it was factually incorrect. And I was like, look, it's a steampunk comic, you know, like I'm not presenting you with like an exact factual account of the past. And his argument was that one of the outfits for the girl called Red Doll that you see on the front page, right, you'll see like one of them is quite a revealing outfit and the other is really conservative, and it's a deliberate juxtaposition. And this guy was basically like, oh, it's Victorian England, it wouldn't be that sexualized. But if you actually read into the bare knuckle boxing bouts and the things that went on, like they were really brutal. Like some of the women's bouts, they would strip to the waist so that the men would have like a bit of titillation, and they would get a coin and put the coin in their palm and close their palm, and then they would basically fight and punch each other, and the first person to drop the coin from their palm lost the bout. So these women would be fighting for like an hour, 2 hours, stripped to the waist, with a coin in their palm, like trying to hold on to this coin while like hordes of men like shout and bayed at them, you know. I think I'm actually in that comic, I'm toning that down a little bit, you know. That's like, it's really eye-watering stuff that these people did. And and you think of like boxing bouts today, and we have like 3-minute rounds. Like some of these fights would go on for hours and hours and hours, you know, guys just punching each other in the face. There's no weight classes, you know. You'd get like massive guys against little guys, and sometimes the little guys would have better stamina and take them out, and it was pretty brutal. So in fact, by actually kind of making it a steampunk comic and writing about it, I think I've actually toned it down a little bit compared to what it was like, you know. People died.
Yeah, well, it's also like James H. Carrot, he's one of the authors of Vintage Tomorrow. You know, he had this very good TED Talk about history and steampunk, and like adding those little lies, like the character you just described, it's also on the Kickstarter page, like putting such details in there. You know, you are revealing history, not as you know, not as it was factually, but you know, you add those elements that people would otherwise not see or not think about. So, you know, by adding such, well, controversial, quote-unquote, things, you know, you open up the discussion, say, you know, because of what you did, we're now talking about it.
Yeah.
So, and the people who are watching this, oh, well, we've learned something today. And also to know, like, I've been in fighting tournaments as a martial artist, and, you know, fighting, like, 3 rounds of 1 minute, you know, you're done. You know, you're winded, even with my stamina, which is quite significant. Not as good as it has been, but because I've been out of it. But you know, we had quite a lot of stamina due to our level for training, and we're out. You know, after those 3 minutes, then we have to do it, recharge, and do it again. So were there short breaks in that hour? I imagine so.
Yeah, I think there would, but yeah, it would be longer than an hour. Like, they do bounce longer than an hour. I think today as well, we've become like so numbed at watching cinema and doing things on video games and on iPads and stuff, that we see like combat and warfare as this thing that's just on a screen. And I think like people forget that like fighting actually hurts. I do pro wrestling, and yeah, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's all real. But man, it hurts. Like, it really hurts. You know, if someone picks you up and you're like 6 foot off the ground and throws you on your back, even on like a sprung board ring, that still hurts. So you imagine just being punched in the face for like over an hour. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine there now. Of course, drugs were more freely to get back in those days. Things like heroin. So I guess there should also have been quite a number of drug use in those rings.
Yeah, I don't know much about it, but I would assume that it was just opiates. You know, like everybody was on opiates in them days, just to keep them going. I would have thought. Yeah. They're like, when you were talking about the characters as well, there's another character that I've got in, who's. I don't want to give too much away, but basically there was one lady that I read about who was a duchess. I think we were talking about this before the camera ran, or maybe we've already spoke about it, but she was a duchess, and basically she'd become widowed and fell on hard times and kind of loved the drink, and they called her the dueling duchess. So basically she'd gone from like being kind of part of the monarchy, some like hanger on, to just boxing her way through the streets of London for money, you know. So like these characters were all actually there before it began. So yeah.
Okay, interesting. Let's see. How far are we in? Okay, almost half an hour. Is there any particular subject you think we still need to talk about, or do you have something to ask me, or
how do people feel like steampunk is perceived, particularly on the internet, in kind of like I don't know, like if you take kind of these forums where we have like comics and cosplay and wrestling, like we'll kind of call it geek culture. Like, how do you feel like other kind of geek culture people perceive steampunk? You know, do you think it's like blending into other things, or do you think it's still quite a niche?
Well, I think it kind of depends on the media. Like, steampunk is, well, particularly in video games, we see the steampunk aesthetic in fantasy. We know Dishonored 2 is coming out. But for people understand it mostly as a aesthetic movement. No, they don't look at the maker culture. They don't talk about it in the way that we do. Like, what is it really? Like, is it, you know, does it have to be Victorian, or you know, is it just pop culture in the past? And anything would go. For me, it's the latter. You know, I want to see Renaissance stuff, which we actually seen in video games. So that would probably be inspired by, I think the game was called Rise of Legends, and other Da Vinci inspired video games that have this. Of course, we have fantasy races like the Dwemer. Steampunk is often used to, you know, especially explain stories. Basically, like, what were the Dwemer? Well, they were this technically advanced race, and technology and magic was the same for them that technology is lost now, so you can only find it in their ruins, and therefore everybody wants to go into those ruins to recover that technology and that magic. It also gives a very good excuse to, you know, do something other than undead when you're exploring dungeons.
Yeah, it's funny that you said that, because when I was talking at the start as well about how I used to be obsessed with steampunk but never really knew it was steampunk, you just reminded me when I used to play Warhammer when I was a kid, I was always the Skavens, you know, the little rat guys.
Yeah.
Like the steampunk rat guys. So
basically,
that's another thing.
I think Warhammer played a very important part actually in popularizing steampunk. I mean, look at how many of the steampunks are also playing Warhammer, especially 40k now, but 40k itself has a lot of Victorian medieval influences in their world. So, and well, you know, there are a lot of historical motives in the design of the races. Like you got the Necrons, who are, you know, clearly inspired by, well, Aztec Egyptians. The Imperium of Man, which is inspired by World War One. We see Second World War influence in there. We see Victorian influence in there. We see medieval influences in there, and it visually explains that world, you know, how that works, especially for races like the Necrons, who are this ancient race from the past that basically have come back to restore their empire. So yeah, it's kind of like the ancient Egyptians coming back from the tombs and trying to rebuild their empire, or the Romans for that matter. Yeah, of course, you've got in the fantasy universe of Warhammer, we had the Skavens. I don't know if they're in the Sigmar version of the game.
Yeah, they've rebooted it, haven't they? I don't know if they are.
Yeah, like you've got the Skavens, you've got the Dwarves, which are, you know, very steampunkish, and you've got the Empire that became more steampunkish as time went on. You know, with clockwork steeds, you know, the steam tanks, they always had those. It's also plays into what's popular in pop culture at the time. So I guess the guys at Games Workshop were either ahead of their time, or they were the ones who popularized it.
Yeah, like we said, it's always been there. I mean, like, I am a massive comic collector, and like I get my comic books every month, and it was probably about maybe 3 or 4 months ago they did a redesign on a character called the Hobgoblin. You know this character?
Yeah, I know.
And they basically just like redesigned him, and he looks really good actually. Like, and gave him kind of like Da Vinci style wings, and kind of steampunked him up a bit, and he looks really good. You know, like it really suits the aesthetic of the character. So even now, you know, it's coming into something as big as a Spider-Man comic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's like, you know, it has become kind of a stereotype thanks to World of Warcraft, where you've got the goblins as well. They're called goblins in that game, right?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and you know, they're also the tech guys. They're the equivalent of the dwarves in that game, which are also steampunk inspired.
Yeah.
You know, but also, you know, to tell a tale, and you know, they have the dwarves who are technically advanced with their gyrocopters and bombers and whatnot, and they wanted to have a horde version, and that became the goblins, or the you know, which kind of is a play on the gremlins, I suppose, that supposed to hunt aviation engines. So yeah, it's very kind of going full circle there. But yeah, it's, I think in people do not understand, I think, that in video games especially, that the steampunk aesthetic is used as a way of depicting civilizations, their place in that world, or what they had been in their past. You know, and also to have variation on the undead, because you've got like a lot of undead in dungeons. Using robots is a very good way to, you know, spice it up a little. You know, instead of undead, we have robots in unexplored dungeons. Yeah,
they did that in Skyrim a lot, didn't they? There was kind of gold ones where there was
the Dwemer,
robot. Yeah.
You know, and it also brings up the mystery of how that race disappeared and stuff. Yeah. I actually have a video on that, which I hope to. Maybe I can do that topic this weekend, because I want to have another vlog out this weekend. Let's see what else. Yeah, so yeah, there's the storytelling aspect is probably the most important thing that people do not really understand. And you see the same goes for anime. You know, there you've got also the steampunk aesthetic. Lost Exile is probably one of my most favorite series. Then there's a very recent one which is about basically people living on trains while being attacked by zombies. Which is very steampunk inspired. But you know, again, they use the timeless aesthetics, you know, the foppish clothes, that inspired by the French aristocracy of the 17th and 18th century. You know, show nobility. That's how they depict nobility in a lot of these science fiction worlds. Gundam is a very good example.
Yeah, it seems like it's been kind of more inherent in anime for a lot longer. You know, it seems as if like it's been more of a thing in anime
Very long, since the
more
70s.
together than it has. I mean, like, yeah.
With the first Gundam series already had that, you know, the foppish clothes, and you know they also had Battleship Yamamoto, which was literally the ship Yamamoto, the actual battleship Yamamoto in space.
Yeah.
So the Japanese really like to revive their own history by putting it in science fiction settings. So yeah, they have a very long-standing tradition in animation with that. They also like retold Samurai 7 in modern anime.
There's is it Steam Boy? Have you seen that one as well?
Yeah, I have.
Movie.
But that Steam Boy is very interesting because what you also notice with certain Japanese animators is they are very inspired by 19th century Europe. And of course they have a very unique history with the industrialization, because it was, well, not the industrialization wasn't forced upon them, but Western influence was forced upon them. When an American battleship sailed into the harbor, forcing them to open their harbors to the west, or at least to the American market. I guess I should also maybe do a historical episode on the Dutch in Japan, because they were for a very long time the only Westerners that were allowed there. That's how many of the Japanese got their weapons, by purchasing it from Dutch traders, which were...
Yeah. Japan was quite a brutal place if you went there as a foreigner and they didn't want you there. Like, some of the things that they used to do to outsiders who weren't
especially
invited.
Christians,
were pretty gruesome. Like, quite nasty. Quite nasty.
Yeah, well, for me it's also kind of a painful subject, because my mother had been in a Japanese prison camp during the Second World War.
Ah, okay.
So yeah, it's
also.
Mm.
Yeah.
So it's rather weird for me to talk about Japanese history, especially, you know, my mother's the kind of person who likes to remind me that thanks to the bombing of Hiroshima that I'm alive now. So
mixed messages, mixed feelings.
Yeah, you know, the ugly nuances of history that makes an untangled mess. And I think steampunk can be very important, you know, to tell those very similar tales. Like, yesterday I talked with Martijn Adelman about Max Havelaar, which is basically about Dutch Indies and what the Dutch did there. And he compared a zombie uprising with the oppression of the local population by both its local nobility and the Dutch. Especially when you watch the movie Max Havelaar, which exists with English translation for those who want to watch it. It's a very good depiction of... they say it's the book that ended colonialism. Just so you have an idea how much Max Havelaar impacted Dutch way of thinking about Indonesia. And I also talked about, you know, the female character with the exposed midriff, like to, you know, explain those little tidbits on history. You know, those little lies give us that image of what happened. Not how it happened, but what it was like.
That's my third stage for my characterizations, like, because I'm always drawing characters for the book, and I've planned it out where my first batch of characters are all going to be kind of the ones you would find, or the ones that I've read about in the books that you would find in general towns and things like that in Victorian England. So like the general fighters, the aristocracy. I've got a character who's a fisherman. I've got one who's a brothel madam who like fights people that don't pay up and things like that. And then my second round that I've been researching is I really want to kind of bring in a circus theme, like a freak show theme, and bring in the characters from that. But my third round is then I want to do kind of like a Commonwealth, and bring in like characters from different places within the British Empire to kind of like spread it globally. So that's my third stage. So I've only just started like researching that now. But I mean, like the British Empire was like nearly half the world, was it? It was, it was massive. Yeah, it was huge. So that's my next step for that. What else was I going to say? Yeah, also as well, I've got a really great issue 3 lined up if we manage to get to issue 3 that I think a lot of people will like, because we were talking about kind of putting historical events and things like that into these works. And issue 3, I've got like a great fight scene on top of the Flying Scotsman train, which is like the book that I really want to get to, that I think people will really enjoy. So yeah, that's my aim for that. So yeah.
Are there any other people you want to mention who worked on the comic?
Yeah, actually, I should probably mention them because like I haven't really mentioned them, and they are like massive. So the main artist who's done all our pages is a guy called Jake Bilbao. He lives in the Philippines, and he's actually drawn for Marvel Comics and Dynamite Comics before. He's drawn a Wolverine comic for Marvel, and he's drawn a book called Pathfinder for Dynamite, which was kind of like a role-playing comic book. So that's quite interesting. So he's worked for them, and obviously our cover is by a current DC Comics artist called Maria Sanapo, who's very current. She did like some DC Bombshells covers, and she's really quite big at the minute. But to keep it kind of not looking old-fashioned, but to keep a kind of old aesthetic, I didn't really want it digitally coloured, because I find digital colouring, unless it's done really, really well and it's done by a real professional studio, I just find digital colouring like so sterile and just a little flat, really. Like it can be done really well. I'm not by any means saying that digital colouring is entirely awful. But when I look at a lot of kind of like indie comics, they've been digitally coloured and it just looks a bit flat. And I think if you're going to colour something digitally and it needs to be good, you need like a real high-end professional studio working on it. So I wanted it done in like normal old-fashioned colours. And I managed to find an illustrator who's Romanian called Pika. And she had like a picture, well, going back to Japan, she'd done a watercolor picture of a geisha on her website. And just the skin tones in it that she'd done was just like absolutely remarkable. And I was like, I want her to color my comic. So I messaged her, and she'd never colored comics before. And she was quite apprehensive. She was like, look, are you sure you want me to do this? It's not my forte. And I was like, no, it'll be fine. I trust you. So she did like a test page for me, and I was like, yeah, it's good. Let's go ahead with it. And I think it works really well because Jake, the guy who does the pencils, actually works wholly on a Wacom tablet and works on computer. So the pencils are done on a computer and the colouring is done by hand, where usually it would be the other way around. But I think it comes off really well. Like if you've got the preview and you see the first panel where they're at the fair, like I'm so happy with that as an opening panel. I think it just looks like breathtaking as a splash page. Yeah. So yeah, like that's the team that we've got working on it, and then me, and it's my first comic. So yeah, I've got big plans for it. I've got a lot of issues written, a lot of characters that I want to put in, and this first issue will kind of set it up. And there's a little twist at the end that's really nice. I don't want to give too much away. There's lots of action in it, but it's got a good plot. It's not just people fighting for no particular reason, which I think is important. Each character has their own reason for being there, and that reason changes throughout the book, and they'll question that reason. The characters aren't one-dimensional, you know. There's the line between a bad guy and a good guy is totally fudged and blurred, as it often is in life. So yeah, I think people will like it.
Okay. I think it's, with that being said, I think it's time for the final word. Do you have any message for the viewers?
I'd just like to say to the viewers, like, please support it, because it has taken me like 3 years. And if you're remotely interested in it, like, even the PDF is just $4. So it would be a massive help. But apart from that, I really just want to like thank the people who have taken it on board. Like, the internet is such a weird and wonderful place, and it can be like your worst nightmare, and it can be your best friend at the same time when you put stuff on it. So, for instance, someone told me to put it on this like website called Imager, which I didn't know much about, and it's just do you know this site, Imager?
No, I haven't.
It's just a site for images. So, like, someone was like, oh, you should put it on there. Okay, so I put like some of the artwork on, and I put the cover on, which is done by like a current DC Comics artist, and it's a really good cover, and I think the colors are really beautiful. Like, I put it on, and it was just like people being negative, and I was like, oh, this is like the worst, most negative website I've ever been on. Mm-hmm. So sometimes the internet can be like your worst enemy, but then I've met people on here who I don't even know that have just taken the idea that I've came up with and ran with it, and they're the people that I'd like to thank the most, you know, like, because there's people that I've never met who have spent hours like putting my comics on blogs and websites and things like that for me, and supporting the book and sharing it with friends and family, and messaging me and asking if there's anything they can do to help, and like I cannot thank those people enough, you know. Like, you probably know, like, yourself, with putting a blog on the internet, you get lots of like smart marks who like sit about and don't do anything, and just comment and be negative, and it's like, go and do something. Like, make something. Like, that's the most glorious thing in life. Like, make a video blog about steampunk, or make a comic book, or like sew a costume for like a steampunk convention, or go and bake a cake. Like, just make something and do something, you know. Like, don't be negative. Like, don't put these negative comments on. Create something, or if you're not creating something, support someone who is creating something. And I think like the people who do that are the people that I'd like to thank the most. So like yourself for doing this and putting me on, like, thank you very much. Yeah. Because like if it wasn't for people like me and you and the people that support us actually making stuff and supporting it, like, what would the internet be? It would just be a hole of negativity. So my thanks go out to, yeah. That's my thanks. That was a little bit of a rant there, actually. But
no, that's okay. That's the entire point of the show. Yeah, I think those were good words to close by. So with that, we'll end this episode of Radio Retro Future. And as always, everyone, have a good one and make it your way.
Much better than Mars. Mars is dry and cold and dark and red, and I prefer green, fresh, sunny Earth, actually.
For steampunk, for example, future is one of the greatest inspirations. It's funny how something that hasn't happened yet can inspire such huge and massive creativity.
Don't have too much respect for the old literature and play with literature. That's what I would like everyone to do.
Get your stuff done.
Get your stuff done. They're waiting on you.
Do it all once more. Watch me. I'm going to show you the next 2 parts right here.